Okay, thank you, Yvonne, Julian, and Bode Museum for having me, and thank you, David. I think our talk's going to overlap somewhat. It may look as if that's been designed, but it hasn't. It's just maybe, like-minded spirits. But I love the idea that maybe the big idea is that children will misbehave in order to get into the museum. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit of, I suppose, a bit of art theory, but also a few practical examples of what this means when you put it into practice, or try to, and what you learn through doing. So I think a lot of the philosophy I have is about just try some things, see what happens, and then we'll learn from any mistakes we make. That's generally the adage. So I'm starting with this long title. I don't think this was the advertised title. I just made this up as I was putting it together. But it's really about not just the Institute as the museum, but the Institute of Art and the Institute of Culture. My starting point is this vehicle is sort of broken, and we have to think about how to fix it. And I'll just put a bit of context. This is the institution that I took over in February this year, which is basically the main art museums in the city of Manchester. So this is the Manchester Art Gallery, built in 1824. The adjoining Athenaeum, built in 1825. And the Whitworth Art Gallery, initiated in 1889. Big institutions at the center of the city. And so really for me, this was a kind of challenge for me to think, how could we apply a lot of the things I've done historically in the mainstream? What is now one of the principal art museums in the UK, how could we apply some new thinking to very old models, and what might happen if we did that? So I use this diagram a lot. There's some slides in here that I use all the time, so forgive me. But this is what I call the parabolic arc of modernity. And this is a diagram, a sort of back of the cigarette packet drawing I did many years ago, beginning a project with the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. And it really describes, I suppose, the rise and fall of Western civilization, you might say, but specifically the bubble in which our understanding of art as we know it was created and thrived. So it begins in 1848, in the year of revolution in Europe, when we have industrialization, the rising middle classes, the art market, and museums evolving into what we know now. And it ends somewhere in about 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and with the rise of the World Wide Web. And between these 2 points, we could say maybe this is the height of modernity, the modern project. And somewhere near the top is perhaps Picasso's Damoiseau d'Avignon, and maybe Einstein's theory of relativity. And within that, this oxygen tank is where our Eurocentric idea of what art was conceptualized and thrived. Somewhere in this mix is Walter Benjamin, who in his sort of 1930s essay begins to see the technologization of culture emerge and tries to reinstate an idea of the object or the aura at the forefront of artistic thinking. I personally am now thinking about ways in which we can escape this capture, you might say. Another picture I use a lot is the first picture I studied as an art historian. This is Friedrich's Wander Above the Sea of Fog, as we call it in English. And this is what I refer to continually as the box cover image for the software of modernity. So if you were going to go to Amazon online and buy your software for how to do modern art, this would be on the cover. And it's the single solitary male genius artist striding above the clouds, slightly apart from society, not in it and mixed up in its messiness, taking us to some unknown future, but one in which the artist or the avant-garde guides us as we follow them forward. Oops, I've done something wrong there. This one? Ah. Okay. Talking of software engineers, this is the software engineer, Immanuel Kant, who prescribed the dual framework of purposeless purpose. So art is not for any use. It is useless. That's its use. Of course, it's more complicated than this, but that was the single one pillar. The other pillar was the idea of the disinterested spectator. So when you look at art, you think about it on art's terms, not on your own. You lose your inhibitions and baggage and your thoughts about politics and what you need to do at the weekend, etc. And this really creates this idea of, I suppose, the world of things that are art and the world of things that are not art, autonomous art. And this world of capture, presented here in this very simplistic diagram, of things that can at some points be art, at some points not art. At some points, things can become art, like Duchamp's urinal, for example. But equally, things can become, things that were art can then become not art. And Duchamp conceptualized this as the reciprocal ready-made, in which he said to turn a Rembrandt into an ironing board. But interestingly, this is a story that is not repeated much about Duchamp. Everybody focuses on the urinal because it was all about turning things into art. What actually he was saying was something else. For further discussion, maybe not for here. So in a lot of the thinking and conversations I've been having lately, one of the projects has been to move away from this model of autonomous art into something else, and a way to think about art that isn't art or not art, but is maybe thinking about art as a process. Art as not a singular point, a singular object in time and space, but a movement of things, of modes, of operations, of activities, of people in time and space. And this, in a way, creates what I will later on describe as the coefficient of art. Not whether something is art or not, but to what degree something is art. How much art do we have here? In a sculpture, in a museum, in farming, in cooking, in whatever it might be in life. Not unconnected to this thinking about movement in time and space is the framework in which we are now operating now, which is very distinct from the 1930s moment, you might say, the Walter Benjamin moment. This is a diagram that shows the plumbing of the World Wide Web. These are actually the physical cables that travel between continents to join up the internet. And then beyond this is then distributed through other domestic and industrial mechanisms. But what this change in dynamic created in the world was, I suppose, really created in its fullest form in the 1980s, in that pre-1989 moment, when this idea of thinking in terms of vectors and flows really came to fruition. And one person who really started to understand this was a chemist called Margaret Thatcher, who was interested in systems and processes. And it was really through this thinking that she created a version of free market capitalism that she then enacted upon Britain. And this is a picture of Margaret Thatcher in the town of Middlesbrough for a press photograph. This is a staged press photograph that was famously known as the Walk in the Wilderness. And this is Margaret with her handbag and her heels, tottering across the wasteland of the demolished steel factory. And this photograph signals the end of making industry, the end of a culture that manufactures, into a nation based upon service, upon technology. We no longer have to get our hands dirty. We can be freed and liberated through technology to become a super race, even, if we were kind of to use our Caspar David Friedrich analogies. The flip side of this, I'm making a lot of shortcuts here, is the flip side of this. This is Middlesbrough 2 years ago. A friend of mine called Mohammed, a refugee, actually an asylum seeker, if you're going to be technically correct, from Iraq, who was rehoused in Middlesbrough, that same space. And these are the kind of the dualities, in a way, the beginning and the end of the curve of modernity. Here we have now, this is our Caspar David Friedrich for 2018. Someone who's been rehoused in a house in Middlesbrough, in the northeast of England, as a result of the privatization of the migration control system. This is what was then a heated moment in British politics around refugees moving into places where they didn't belong, or whatever the language was, whatever the culture was. but in fact relocated because a private landlord had a contract with a multinational company called Group 4, who has a contract with the British government to take on asylum seekers, in which they get paid £45 per person per night for each refugee they house in a property. So this is the reality. This is culture. Welcome, everybody. Not unrelated again is this is the when I used to work in Middlesbrough. This is the map I used to show where Middlesbrough was, and it's the Brexit map of Britain. So Middlesbrough is the top right-hand corner. Wales there, if you want to know where Wales was, is on the left with the blue bit. So this is Middlesbrough. The darkest spot is Teesside. In Middlesbrough, the highest voting Brexit ward in the country, 74% leave Europe. And this is really because, as a result of this globalized flow system, of really what happened was that the people who were left behind, the people who suffered, the people who were not part of, the people who knew how to take control of the system, who knew how to work the plumbing, who knew how to control the aesthetics, the aesthetic regime, were the ones who would be in power. And those that were without power are the red. So in a way, a lot of the thinking I've been doing recently, in recent years, has been, well, okay, say our institutions were built in this moment of ascendancy in the 19th century, in a moment of growth, in a moment of power, in a moment of colonization. What happens when we try and run an institution in a moment of decline or a moment of transition, however we want to think about it? What kind of an institution would we build or deconstruct? And in order to do this, part of that process has been looking at, well, what happened before 1848? What were people doing that could have taken us that way instead of that way? Who were the voices? Even then, they were all human beings just like everybody else, as David has pointed out, even going back to Neanderthals. What was the thinking then that was also trying to fight against this shift towards free market capital and the dehumanization of society? And one of those voices was this artist, educator, social reformer, conservationist, ecologist called John Ruskin. And John Ruskin really proposed, he was the person that coined the term head, heart, and hand, about a way of thinking and acting in the world which has art at its center, not for its own sake, but to be used as a tool for social change, to make ethical decisions, to understand the world in order to act ethically in it. This is a picture of one of John Ruskin's first art classes at Oxford University. He was first professor of art at Oxford. And in one of his first lessons, he got all his art students to build a road between two villages across a bog to stop the spread of cholera. And interestingly, the students pictured here all went on to really amazing things, such as Oscar Wilde, Arnold Toynbee, the social reformer, Canon Rawnsley, who founded the National Trust Conservation Charity. But the point was about this very point of learning through making and doing, and acting in the world, not just through academia, not just about considering art as an object, but as a process we might enact upon the world. This was manifest in Ruskin's work creating this. This is the Coniston Institute, an institute, a kind of quasi-museum for a working-class mining community, whereby they would have a collection which was not displayed, again, for its own delectation, but was a tool to educate, to understand how the world works, of nature, of art, of literature, books, and then to really use this information, use this knowledge in order to be better citizens, you might say. But alongside this was a world of manufacture and making, because the idea was that through the process of making, you understood how to make a transformation, either on a small scale, but also on a large scale, in carving wood, in making lace. So the women made lace, the men carved wood. This was the origins of the arts and crafts movement, which William Morris then picked up from Ruskin's thinking, although they fell out, I think, in quite a big way. Ruskin really wanted this handicraft version, not the sort of luxury version that I think Morris eventually led to. But this was stuff that was okay. This is stuff you did in the evening, and you traded for a little bit of extra money. It wasn't a career. It was a way of using art in your ordinary life after you'd worked in the field or worked down the mine. This thinking about the micro and the macro infected people like Gandhi, who picked up Ruskin's book Unto This Last of 1860 and used it as basically his script for how to reform Gandhi in a post-colonial situation, but also how to create an education system based on doing and making rather than learning by rote. Now, interestingly, Ruskin gave a lecture in Manchester in 1857 called The Political Economy of Art. And in this book, in this essay, he breaks his treatise into two parts. One, how to acquire art for ethical purpose. So he's basically berating the industrialists of Manchester, then the biggest industrial city in the world, saying, stop buying art for your own power. Stop buying art because you think it makes you look good. Buy art for ethics and for society. And in the second part, he says, this is how to use art to make social change happen. This book then becomes Unto This Last, which is the book that influences Gandhi, the British Labour Party, and many other things. But it's founded in the idea of art being central to how we think and behave in society. So really, this 19th century thinking starts to shed light on how we might act now, because this was a way of thinking that was suppressed. So my art historical education never talked about Ruskin as the social reformer. It talked about Ruskin who promotes Turner, which begats Monet, which begats Cézanne, which begats Mondrian. It's the formal progression of the art object in time, not the formal progression of art as social practice. So in a way, reclaiming this history, reclaiming the complexity of how things work in the world is something dear to my heart, and has drawn me together with a wide range of people from across Europe, the United States, but also now in the emerging South, around this movement, you might say, that I've been involved in called arte util, art as a tool, a coin termed initially by the artist Tanya Bagheera, who we began working with, but has also been used in many other places in different time zones, including recently we found arte utile in Mexico in the 1930s by Mexican muralists. And really on the back of this, we have created this website, this archive, this network of activity and people called Arte Util, which starts to really propose the use value of art as something that should be taken seriously again, that should be reconnected on the end of this parabolic arc. At this moment when we most need artistic thinking, culture, creative thinking in the ordinary, these may be the means in which we could then start to spread these ideas and reconnect with this as a way of working. So we have the criteria on the website. I won't go into those now. Case studies, projects, and then over 300 case studies from around the world which give examples of what we might call useful art. So Hamata Gut's Silent University for refugees and asylum seekers, Renzo Martin's Institute for Human Activities, which was shown in Berlin maybe 2 or 3 years ago here. Better known artists such as the Astor Gates Dorchester Projects, and many, many more, including historical examples, which might include the Bauhaus or Ruskin himself. And this culminated in 2013 with a major blockbuster show, if you like, of non-object work called the Museum of Arte Util at the Van Abbey Museum in Eindhoven, which then has now continued as these various manifestations of this idea in different locations, including this is the current Office of Useful Art in SALT in Istanbul, mapping out projects in the Arabic world. This is the escuela of Arte Util that we held in San Francisco last year, 7 weeks for 66 students from the Bay Area, as part of an exhibition with Tanya at the YBCA and SF MoMA. This is what the school looked like, trying to teach useful art in various diagrams. I'm quite a fan of a diagram, you might tell. And then this year, another manifestation of this escuela at MUAC in Mexico City, focusing on what we call Aligal. So this is ways of working with artistic competence that work in between legal states. So finding legal loopholes in the law in order to basically create projects or activism which applies artistic competence. There's our Mexican students. And then underpinning this is a book which we're currently thinking about extending, rewriting, but it's been translated into about 10 languages now. And it's called Towards a Lexicon of Usership by the writer Stephen Wright. And it's really a definition of terms that are being phased out and new emerging terms that are coming in. And one of those terms that I picked up on in order to think about how we might make a museum work was the Museum 3.0. And for me, when I was starting work in a place like Middlesbrough, which is, like the back end of Britain, you might say, this seemed to be the best place to try it out. So to put it simply, Museum 3.0 is described as the user-generated model. Museum 1.0 is you put the precious things in the museum, people come along, they see the wonderful thing, their life is transformed, they go away a better human being. Museum 2.0 is what I would call sort of maybe the more current model, which is around participation. So you come in, you participate, or you co-produce in the production of work, but still that's someone else's agenda. It's still creating the cultural capital for the artist or for the institution. It's still the artist's idea of a project, which then you basically allow people to come in and help make, help produce, which then ultimately sees the principal beneficiary being the artist or the institution. So the Museum 3.0 will be one in which we might not destroy the existing museum, but one in which we might bend it and misuse it in order to find a better way of doing things. So this is MIMA, Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, shiny new building, 2007, designed by Dutch architect, because of course if you want to have a shiny modern art museum, you get a Dutch architect to do it, if you can't afford a German one or and I took over this after really at a time when Middlesbrough was being labeled as Britain's Detroit. This is 200 meters from the museum, a neighborhood called Gresham. So this is what life in Middlesbrough is like. And so quite rightly, people in Middlesbrough are saying, we don't need a museum, thank you very much. We don't need modern art. This is a backdoor colonialism from London, New York, Paris. We don't need this stuff you called art. It has no relevance to us because they don't use it on the ordinary. So the question became, how could we rethink the museum to get to the point where people go, oh yeah, that's what a museum's for. I get it. It's not to show your shiny objects from New York. It's to do something actually for us. So how could we begin thinking about that? Well, the fundamental principle, I suppose, was about reconceptualizing the internal architecture of the museum and, in a way, of art itself. So this is the old model. Forgive the jargon, but aesthetic regime is basically what I call everything. And at the center of the old model was the idea that exhibitions at the center, art at the center. Then around that you have public programs, school groups, education, community work, servicing the art and to get people from the public or audience, the spectators, in to come and see the art in the middle of the museum. Museum 3.0, we could argue, just flips that around. This is the simple way of thinking about it. At the center of this is the constituencies, the public, or whatever we might want to call them, is people. Servicing this is a program which is a public program. So the public program comes before exhibitions. Education, public thinking, civic imagination, all these things come first. And then the exhibitions and our collections are merely a tool to service that agenda about delivering actually social change. So what does this look like? So the first thing I did in Middlesbrough was to basically do an exhibition that wasn't an international blockbuster, that wasn't Gerhard Richter, that wasn't Louise Bourgeois, that wasn't stuff imported from elsewhere to say, hey, you too can enjoy modern and contemporary art because it's really good for you. If you just get to understand it, you'll be much better people. And said, well, what about your culture? What about your history? So let's do an exhibition about the history of art in Middlesbrough for the last 200 years, as long as the town existed. And we won't decide what it is. We will collectively decide as a constituent group what the content of this museum is. So we crowdsourced it. We did a column in the local paper, things on the radio, invited people into the museum for workshops, and basically just created a huge pile-up of material which we could consider to be art, both historic, both contemporary, things that are art, quite clearly, things that are maybe art, things that are quite clearly not art but could be art, or things that are just cooking or gardening or something else. And used this as basically the initial gunshot, you might say, in a war against the institution itself, and started to permeate the museum with this thinking. So this is our own Office of Useful Art, but not one in which there is anything from the collection. It is a space of making. And we called it here, in terms of what David was talking about before, we kind of started to talk about social making. So the idea was you came to make things in the museum, but not just to learn how to make stuff with your hands, but also you get around a table with other people to start to talk about how you might make society, about how you might start to change and plan what we might do in the world. So this, for example, is a workshop we did with Eritrean refugees who'd moved to Middlesbrough recently, and they couldn't get the coffee pots that they could get in Eritrea. They couldn't buy them in the shops in Middlesbrough. So we did this workshop with an artist, Emily Hesse, to basically to make from the clay in the ground, from that broken neighborhood, new coffee pots, which could then use on a daily basis, but they could convey their culture, they could tell their story, they could be in the civic moment, but also they could start to come together to plan how they might start to change their neighborhood as well. This led to public gatherings, using the exhibition spaces as places of convention, of meeting, of creating a democratic culture that wasn't about democratizing culture, if you see the difference. And to translate something from the exhibition, which was, say, a free meal for refugees, into a regular central activity of the museum. So this is every Thursday, where we would give a free meal to over 150 people in the museum atrium and close the galleries specifically so that this became the artwork. This became the work in progress. And again, in which we might start to talk to people we wouldn't ordinarily talk to, and build those bridges between a polarized community. It also led to making projects such as this, which is basically the same groups beginning to learn building skills with wood and so on. And this was a project in which we basically built a Trojan horse. So if you remember the neighborhood with the broken down houses, this is where all these people lived. So the strategy was to basically send a message to the council and to the government to say, actually, stop using the private sector to develop this area, to turn it into something else which it isn't. How can we reclaim this neighborhood from the ground up? So this, whilst a symbolic gesture, was also, which was kind of to wheel this horse from the museum into the neighborhood and have a kind of protest. It was also a way to teach building skills, which could then be translated into rebuilding the houses. And on the back of this, we've secured what's called a community asset transfer from government ownership to community ownership of 3 properties, which then became housing for refugee children who were with unaccompanied adults. And eventually led to a new design for that particular neighborhood of Middlesbrough, which I won't go into detail about now. But I think it's important to say this is really the transition from specific making to making on the macro scale, about what happens when art becomes, as the term has been used before, civic gesture, but beyond gesture, and what happens when it becomes the infrastructure. So rather than art being an object in the world, is a process applied to politics, to economics, to house building, to education, and everything else. This, in a way, led me, I suppose, by various routes to Manchester. So here we are back at the Manchester Art Gallery, where I was invited to try and enact some of this thinking on a big scale, on an institution with a big collection, and with a significant national, international status. So interestingly, like I always do, was to ask the question at the start, well, why is it here in the first place? Why did you even build it? And of course, if you dig back to that pre-1848 moment, built in 1824, they were talking exactly the same things. If you look at the foundation text of this museum, they didn't have any art in the museum when they started. It was for the education of the working classes. It was to create social change. And to my great delight, when I looked at the original architectural drawings for this museum by Charles Barry, on the front cover of the architectural plans was the Latin phrase, which translated as nothing beautiful unless useful. So then we have our kind of key to the door to reclaim this history of the institution, to say it wasn't always about the spectator, it wasn't about the tourist economy, it wasn't about the object, it was about using these objects, using this process of art as a civic think tank for how we might imagine the world otherwise. So now we can really play. And just to give you two examples of projects which we're now beginning, this is an archaeological project as well. I'm picking up from David here. But this is a project we're doing with a community from Moss Side. And Moss Side was infamous in the 1980s, in Margaret Thatcher's time, as basically the place where the race riots happened in the UK in the 1980s. And a lot of that neighborhood was demolished after the riots, including a nightclub called the Reno, which was an Afro-Caribbean nightclub at the center of this community where basically everything happened. This is where the social thinking happened. This is where people picked up the weapons. This is where people listened to the music. This is where people wanted to take back control, as the language goes. And this community group basically initially started as an oral history project around the nightclub that got demolished, but rapidly turned into an archaeological dig of the site where the nightclub was. And so what's happening next year at the Whitworth Art Gallery is we're giving one whole major space at the center of the museum to this community group to run the museum on their own terms, to present the Reno nightclub, to present the archaeological findings of broken glasses and crack pipes and needles and drugs and records and the life, the culture that they had, as a way to rethink our own institution itself, that they can be our critical friends and actually speak as a constituency, as a user group that can start to direct what the museum becomes from within rather than from without. Similarly, at the Manchester Art Gallery, we've accommodated or started to accommodate things that are not art, or maybe not art, or a bit like art, things that are on the coefficient of art. This is the spontaneous memorial to the Manchester Arena bombing that took place just over a year ago at an Ariana Grande concert, suicide bomber, killing 26 people in Manchester. And this, in the center square, around the statue of the person that founded the museum, I mean, this isn't common knowledge, because people forget statues. This is the flowers, the teddy bears, the letters that were written and displayed in public. If you like a kind of spontaneous artwork that's not an artwork, but it's using artistic thinking and competency and empathy in a collective sense to create something that has a cultural function. So we've now basically housed that archive of material, every flower, every balloon, every teddy bear, every letter, within the institution, not as an art object or as an installation, but a working operative device which can be used by people in the day-to-day, in creating empathy, in understanding grief, in whatever terms it might be. We don't even know yet. It might become something else in the future. But what this is, in a way, beginning to point to is an idea of culture, an idea of art, as a way of thinking and acting in the world and starting to think about how we might change it. And transforming the idea of aesthetics as being something that isn't for a small number of people, or a small idea, or a small object, but a way of acting in the world and a way of taking control of the world. So this idea of making, this idea of aesthetics, is really about something that everybody could reclaim, that they have lost. And maybe we can start to challenge an idea of what art is and think about it as something which is for everybody and not just the rich, the powerful, to use in their claim for power. The final project I'm just going to mention which kind of demonstrates this thinking and also demonstrates why I think Walter Benjamin is no longer applicable. This is at the Manchester Art Gallery. This is a painting on the wall called Hylas and the Nymphs. I don't know whether you know this story. But the week I started, an artist, Sonia Boyce, who's from the British Black Art movement, worked with some community members to remove this painting to provoke a discussion to see what would happen. Not to ban it, as it was suggested, but to say, well, if we took it away, how might we start to generally question representations of women and culture in society, which led to a very dramatic response, accusations of censorship, of the female curators, it's largely female curators in the museum, of being feminazis, of being lefty snowflakes, etc., etc. To the point where there was a whole Twitter storm around the world. This is Manchester Art Gallery dressed up in one of the many memes that was proposed, which kind of accentuated these culture wars, but also accentuated the fact that people had forgotten the idea that an institution like this was not a preservation chamber for objects, but was specifically designed to employ art in the processes of social change for people in society. Fortunately, some people got it. Here's the New York Times. But I will end there with Vladimir Putin, who in a way is my poster boy of what happens when rich and powerful people know really how to use aesthetics. The end.